for the Toronto-Danforth. Thank you very much there, Craig Scott.
Delighted to be here, Reg. Thank you.
One thing about your riding, it actually used to belong to the late Jack Layton. All of us have stories of when we first met Jack Layton. Mine went back to Vancouver. He was at a pride parade there. I remember standing off to the side. He was talking to someone, and then afterwards I went up and talked to him. And what amazed me about that gentleman, he took the time to answer my question, and he knew exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, by all accounts, you hear stories like that a lot. Jack was both a very smart individual, and he connected with people at the same time. And believe me, when you're representing a riding after him, you learn exactly how revered he was, frankly.
One thing about the topic of veterans in politics is that your grandfather, he was involved in World War One. He was injured in World War One. I think he lost a leg.
Yes.
He must have shared stories with you over the years of what he saw during war.
Well, the irony is he couldn't have, because he died about 20 years after the war of his injuries. He lost his leg at the Battle of Drocourt-Quéant, which was the major battle that broke the Hindenburg Line on September 2nd of 1918, not far east of Arras. Lost his leg, created his own tourniquet with his kilt, because he fought in a kilt. He was part of the Nova Scotia Highlanders. And when he was eventually rescued, it had already begun to get gangrenous. So over the next 20 years, sort of a progressive problem with the flesh had to be dealt with, and he had something like 15 to 20 different surgeries, and eventually he committed suicide in a few months before my mother was born. So she never knew her father, and I didn't know my grandfather, but I still think of him because this ring here was what he was wearing when he was injured on the battlefield in 1918. It was passed on from my grandmother to my mother's oldest sister, and then to me, and I've had it for about 15 years.
Do you find that's one reason right now why you've now introduced a bill to be debated on real quick in the legislature in regards to veterans and how it has affected certain population within the veteran community?
I'd have to say that I've long had a strong interest in the military, the central place the military, and obviously the serving members have played in Canadian history. Nothing but respect for anybody who would serve. But my own personal history with it's not only my grandfather, but particularly my grandfather, has created that personal connection. Since I'm also gay, I've also had an interest just to know what part the LGBTQ community has played in our military history. And of course, there's lots of good that nobody will know about, because there have been serving members who are from the community since time immemorial. They just haven't been known as such. But until 1992, anybody who was openly a member, a lesbian or gay, just for example, or obviously transgendered as well, would be subject to automatic discharge. And in 1992, that was changed. The Charter of Rights had an impact on that, and one could not formally be discharged on that basis. And let's just say that since then, it's not been the same kind of discriminatory policy that existed before. So my motion calls for the military ombudsman to be charged, as in given the powers by the Minister of Defense under ministerial directives that allow the minister to do this, to engage in a study and investigation about what the shape of discrimination was up to 1992, whether or not discharge under another name still continues, conduct unbecoming, or are there harassment factors that might still exist in parts of the military that result in people, quote unquote, voluntarily leaving but basically being forced out? Does that happen? And then for him to come up with a framework for the government to apologize for the treatment, especially before 1992, and to create a mechanism for those who are still alive, many of whom will be, or family members to apply for a specific apology. And so this motion is on the books. It's been filed in the House, tabled in the House. Chances of it actually getting debated with only a year left in this Parliament before the next election are, I'd have to say, pretty slim, because
So you'd have to reintroduce it again.
have to reintroduce it again. Or if my party, the NDP, were the official opposition, if we do actually form government because of having the most seats, this has already been passed through the policy grinder on our side, and I'd be expecting the next Minister of Defence to actually do what I'm asking in the motion. So it could happen within, not much more than a year.
I think it should, because anyone who joined the military, I as I told you before, and I shared with countless people, I served for almost 9 years and went over to Iran in '88. I think anyone that picks up a weapon, puts on a uniform, they deserve to respect. And whatever happens, whatever consenting adults do, behind closed doors, that's their own business.
Right.
And it's one thing I'm a strong supporter of. You were a law professor at 2 different universities here in Toronto, York University and the Toronto University.
Mm-hmm.
With the China now getting into a trade deal with China being done, effective October 1st, how is that going to affect not only the Aboriginal rights but other individuals' rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and even the Canadian Constitution? As I was asking before, if any of these rights interfered with our individual rights, which rights would override it? Would this federal deal with China, a trade deal, would it actually be pushed off to the side and say, no, you can't sue us? Or would they basically, the Chinese, win in the lawsuit? Well,
this FIPA, we're calling it, but the Canada-China Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, so the Canada-China FIPA, is a very problematic agreement, because not only does it allow for some protection for companies, Canadian companies investing in China and Chinese companies investing in Canada, it actually does it unequally, without full reciprocity. So in fact, Chinese companies have been given greater rights and privileges under the agreement than Canadian companies will end up enjoying in China. That's the first problem. The second problem is that it's subject to dispute settlement mechanism that basically will allow any Chinese companies investing here to, if they think there's any problematic policy or legislative measure that undermines their corporate rights as protected by the agreement, they can actually take this to arbitration, circumvent the courts. And the experience with arbitral tribunals in all of these investment agreements is they very much have a pro-corporate investor mindset. It's kind of its own transnational elite, its own transnational mentality, whereas the court system of any given country has a job to interpret the laws, keeping in mind the national public interest as well, and to be not leaning to one side or the other. Third thing is, because of the way corporate personality works, if a company from China, a state-owned company, which many of them are, or if they're not, they're often beholden to the Communist Party of China under the current reality. If they invest, and the company that they invest in then begins to purchase up everything else or many other companies in the same sector, it's a door into basically taking over areas of the economy and being beneficiaries of the investment treaty protection mechanisms. Companies that would have used to have been domestic, if they roll into the foreign investor, then the foreign investor's protection is what applies, and they don't have to go to court in order to protect their perceived rights. They can go to this arbitral process. And it's all locked in for 30 years. And so the ability to terminate or withdraw from either side is 30 years in terms of how all of the different deadlines actually work when you analyze it closely. It's an amazingly poor deal, and at the most general level, it undermines the sovereign capabilities of provinces and the federal government to enact the kinds of environmental, public safety kinds of measures that good government should be doing without fear that suddenly a foreign company is going to say, hey, that goes further than we expected. We have an investment that is now worth less because you now have an environmental regulation that says we can't emit this into this river. Or, and here we'll get to your question, let's take the tar sands. The First Nations communities that we know are affected strongly on the ground, apart from the climate change issues of the emissions, but the pollution coming from the tar sands. What if we finally have a framework, either legislated or through the courts, that basically says, either through statutory law or Aboriginal rights that are part of the Constitution, that certain kinds of economic activities that a company is engaging in now have to stop? More than that, there has to be compensation, there has to be money expended on remedying damage to the environment, helping with whatever has been caused to damage people's health. You can imagine all the costs that could build up to a company. And will these companies that are ultimately investing in the tar sands through the Chinese Canada FIPA, will they simply say, oh, that's Canadian law, Canadian law is evolving just like Canadian companies, we have to abide by the Canadian legal framework to the extent that the Canadian legal framework basically says environmental law can shift and you have to absorb the costs? Are they going to say that? Or are they going to say this is a form of expropriation of our investor interests and we can go to an international or transnational tribunal and get compensated by the government for the fact that our rights are now worth less? And so there are any number of scenarios where the only thing between abuse and let's call it an innocuous investment result is the good faith and the kind of the forbearance of the investors. If Chinese companies think in sort of geopolitical terms, they might hold back. They might not be as aggressive as they could be because they don't want to rock the boat. That's the only thing we could have to rely on. Otherwise, if they act like corporations the world over, then you can imagine any number of scenarios whereby environmental rights that are statutory,
even worker rights, anything that is done that looks from a corporate perspective to be on the edge of being illicit because it truly isn't in the name of health and safety of workers or surrounding inhabitants, if you're talking about a extraction site or even a manufacturing plant, or environmental. All these things, there's an exception in most trade and investment rules to say that nothing is affected about the power of a government to engage in those things. But there's very specific and often narrow understandings in the transnational corporate investment community about how far government can go. And so at some level, the investment agreements that we have generally with this dispute settlement mechanism that really hands over authority to decide what governments can and can't do to a kind of a transnational corporate investment oriented arbitral elite whose job it is to float from tribunal to tribunal deciding these kinds of disputes. That's a general problem, but with the Canada-China one, it's even more of a problem because one, it's not a question of being anti-Chinese. It's not even a question of somehow being aggressive towards China because it has a single-party communist government. It's the reality is that it is and remains a dictatorial state ruled by one party that has its tentacles in all major companies that are Chinese-based, and that it controls, for the most part, the strategic decisions of state companies, state-owned companies. Why would we enter into this kind of incredibly unbalanced agreement? So we could actually be dealing with the fact where the Chinese government could be importing workers, undermining the wage. So the minimum wage right now that we're trying to fight for $15 an hour minimum wage, it could be shot all the way down to $2 an hour.
Well,
and then basically on top of that, you know, we also have the mineral rights. We're getting a royalty right now, so it could actually, under this agreement, could it reach the point where the royalty that the state now collecting here in Canada may be wiped out next to nothing?
Well, let's go to the royalties. I think the issue there is, as with all investment, where the where the benefits would flow from the non-royalty profits to the company. And if the company is foreign-based, how much are they able to organize their operations so that it's basically rip and ship? Excuse me. So that very little value added is left to the Canadian economy. The government would still get the same royalty as they might with any domestic company doing the same kind of extraction, or at the same time, at least some Canadian companies might have more of an infrastructure, more of a worker base generally, that might leave more money in Canada for the non-royalty portion. So that's just part of the problem generally of foreign investors. It's a bit of a crapshoot about whether you benefit from the fact your companies can invest in other countries and other countries' companies can invest in yours. It's a bit of a crapshoot who's going to win in any given sector during any given period. But in terms of foreign workers, that I think should really very clearly be something that would fall clearly within the sovereign rights of provincial and federal government to regulate labor, and temporary foreign workers is clearly a major controversial issue at the moment. But the idea that a company could say, you're not allowing us to bring in workers of our nationality who are necessary for our company to operate effectively, would be a real stretch for them to say that's part of an investment right. And so the bigger issue, I think, not to say that I couldn't imagine the argument. They could say, look, our company functions in language X, Chinese. For safety purposes, we need workers who understand Chinese as well. Otherwise, there might be misunderstandings. That's actually kind of the argument used, I think, in a northern BC mine that's owned by a Chinese company, even before this agreement, that began to bring in Mandarin speakers by making Mandarin a job requirement, and completely. But this was outside the investment treaty. The investment treaty hasn't started yet. This was just an abuse that the government allowed of our current temporary foreign workers policies. So the fact that policies can already be abused, especially when you have an acquiescent government or a government that's been asleep at the switch, as it has been on this file under Mr. Kenny in particular, just suggests to you that there's always going to be real-world pressures. So even if a company doesn't say, we will sue you if we can't allow a certain number of our workforce to be brought in because for us it's an operational requirement, but they will potentially be putting certain kinds of political pressure to look the other way or to interpret regulations in a way that accommodates that, without it ever getting to the point of an actual sort of legal confrontation. Real-world power dynamics can follow these kinds of major structural changes. So I don't want to sound like all these things are likely to happen or likely to happen sort of in some massive way, but the potential is created, and some of the scenarios are very real.
Yeah, it's downright scary. You also were a major activist for getting social housing here in Toronto. I know the numbers that were shared with me, we interviewed 2 Toronto City Council members. They were listing numbers about 50 to 75,000 people on the waiting list. You rose up in Parliament. You were raising the number of 90,000, 168,000. You know, with all these numbers being thrown out there, how many people are actually on the waiting list, and how has this affected the economics within Toronto? I mean, this should be a sign that something major is coming.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think the use of figures can be fraught, and I heard yesterday from Councillor Fletcher, who represents the southern half of my federal riding at the city level, that there's 72,000 now on the waiting list, but that's for units. That's for families. That whether the family is a one-person, a couple, or a bigger family, and that the figure of over 100,000, maybe 150, I'm not sure, if one projects from that in terms of a rough average family size of 2, for example, you're looking at 100, maybe 150,000. I wouldn't want to rely solidly on the numbers that one hears at any one time, but it is clearly at least 70,000 units and at least 100,000 people who could be on the waiting list for, they may be towards the tail end of the waiting list, and some of them will get housing soon. But once you get on the waiting list, the current wait apparently is 5, 6, 7 years. That's crazy.
So the economics is the point I was trying to get to is that could this be a sign that Canada may be facing the possibility of some economical slowdown or recession or even worse, possible depression?
Well, there's 2 points to that. One is, as a consequence of inadequate attention to housing needs, you're actually helping fuel a downward spiral when it comes to the individual economic capacity of people who are living in the circumstances where they having to couch surf or make do in a way that doesn't have proper housing. It actually has a collective economic downside as well. The false economies of saving money by not investing, and that's the key word, investing in people and in social infrastructure. The false economies are huge. We live under a mentality for the last 20 years that everything should be looked at as a short-term cost, and if you have to spend $1 million on, say, maintenance of a water main, that's a cost versus something that is both necessary and productive in terms of the multiplier effects it will create because of the social and economic activity it will allow. And, at some rational level, even the current government of Mr. Harper, they'll say, oh, we understand that. They don't really. And they have a very narrow idea of what counts as investment. And from a social democratic perspective, the idea of investing in people and in collective goods that actually empower individuals to themselves become productive and therefore need other state services less, and that create a society with enough equality and enough living and dignity that health and social stresses are minimized, you end up with a much more productive economy generally. There are all kinds of knock-on effects to looking at investment. So I'd say that's the first answer, is that this is contributing to a wasted economic opportunity. The second thing is it's a reflection not so much of the current state of the economy, which one can debate whether it's in the doldrums still or not. I believe it essentially is. Precarious work and finding of jobs is a tremendous problem that this government doesn't recognize. But let's just say that, hold that constant. The real issue is that the federal government, in particular, has backed out of assisting in affordable housing and or social housing since about 1993, when the federal Liberal government massively cut its involvement and began to move sort of regularly out of the field until the Conservatives came in power in 2006 and just continued that trajectory, but maybe with greater speed, to the point that the Canada Housing and Mortgage and Housing Corporation almost seems to be under a mandate from the government to vacate the field from when it comes to any kind of a serious proactive government role. Co-op housing is a major source of housing in my riding, and in a number of funding agreements that have been underpinned by the Canada Housing and Mortgage Company Corporation federally are now coming due, and no promise has been made about continuing those features that include assistance and subsidies so that people on low income in the co-ops can actually afford to stay, and the co-ops can also afford to keep them without going into a higher market rent mode. The government has said they're not going to renew And so they basically said, well, that's what the limit of the commitment was. So they're dodging. They're trying to pretend that, well, we had no more commitment than what the length of these agreements were. That's not the point. These agreements reflected an ongoing public commitment to a federal role. And so between the Liberals starting the ball rolling in 1993 and this government under Stephen Harper's deepening the problem, we've had an almost total abandonment of housing role for the federal government, apart from some retention of, let's call it more emergency, transitional shelter kinds of housing, where the federal government, to be fair to them, still have programs and are trying their own philosophy, one of which they call Housing First, which might work better than some of what's been tried. I'm not saying it isn't. But the broader social and affordable housing picture has been abandoned and downloaded to the provinces, which then gets downloaded to the cities.
Yeah, what the problem with that is that the province of Ontario, we're running a deficit of $300 billion is what they reported.
Yeah.
And already the current premier has, I was reading a newspaper article where it said that she was having problems with adding up the numbers because the numbers were much bigger. So we could actually be looking at, 300, possibly 300 plus billion. And then you have the city of Toronto that the infrastructure has to be updated, the waters, the sewage, the 30-year-old power lines in certain parts. So there's no more money available for this stuff by the federal government pushing it all onto the province and the city. The problem is going to get huge. This is an economical, snowball that we're looking at. And, I hope that a political party gets in that realizes that it's time to start focusing on the people of Canada, because once you focus on the people of Canada and they're in a safe environment, they're living in a safe environment, it's going to cost less money to keep them housed than it's going to cost to throw people in prison.
Or take care of them in the health system
That too.
if it produces health problems. So, I mean, this is an excellent analysis, and I like the idea of, not like that it's happening, but I like your image of the economic snowball. You're exactly right. And I mean, there has to come a point when a government is not only doesn't have to be considered to be brave to start undertaking this kind of economic activity. At the moment, the baselines have been shifted by conservative, right-wing, neoliberal discourse, shared by, at the center of which is the Conservative Party, but shared by a huge chunk of the Liberal Party, which always acts as a drag on that party. The idea that has to be brave to actually counter that philosophy has to be overcome, and we need to get to a point where the average person more and more sees as reasonable the perspective that you've just put forward. And believe me, in politics, education of that sort, where people begin to actually understand that we're cutting off our nose to spite our face with current economic philosophies, it's an uphill battle to get the average person to see that, because in their own life, so many people are just having a hard time making ends meet. They have huge affordability challenges. And the idea that somehow more money would be spent by government on something that doesn't immediately help them, you can very reasonably people react against it. And conservative, and especially conservative populist politicians, exploit that. And they rely on the very people who would benefit most from a more proactive social democratic approach to the economy are the people they often can enlist to support them, because people naturally are looking at their own circumstances, and if they don't see how something immediately helps their situation, they will react to say, why more taxes or why more spending elsewhere when I need help? And it's a cycle that we have to break, and I think a different kind of political, now it requires bravery, so political bravery, but also a more reasonable political discourse where people can actually, without being submerged by politicians shouting at each other, saying that, oh, you're lying, or that you're a communist, or you're whatever, by suggesting proactive government role, that people can be exposed to a more reasonable exchange of views about what makes sense. And at the moment, we don't live in a society that encourages that kind of reasonable debate.
Well, there's one topic I really want to talk about. I know we're pressed for time here, but it's reference to CBC. As what you were talking about, one thing that's been the institution of Canada has been the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. Mm-hmm. It has, every Saturday night with the Hockey Night in Canada, I mean, the arts that they show and all the other information that they're sharing, I mean, the CBC has been the thing that a lot of Canadians turn to for information, for entertainment, for, to be informed. It's part of their life.
Yeah.
How is that, what I want you to quickly talk about is, how is that being affected now with all the cuts going on and everything that's happened in CBC?
It's a very complex file because it's not just a question of government slow but steady defunding or CBC management that seem to be adopting a sort of a de facto privatization agenda. Sometimes it seems that way on behalf of the government, but it's also the environment, the changing nature of digital communications, the internet, the Netflix phenomenon. The challenges for public broadcasters are very real, and so at one level we have to make sure that CBC is able to be nimble and to compete, and the way I think of it is to be the producer of quality content that not only speaks to Canadians but that is exportable. And so I do believe in the idea of a more vibrant CBC that is let's call it doing battle in the broadcasting and the content producing space, but there needs to be a robust floor of public support, and that includes public dollars, especially when it comes to telling Canadian stories to Canadians, and especially when it comes to news, and I would say critical debates around public issues. If a public broadcasting corporation can't have a reasonable stream of money they can count on year by year, not looking around the corner for the next round of cuts, it can't do its job. And we're put at the mercy of the competitive marketplace, where we know it's just as simple as that corporate control and large wealthy owner control of the media has perfidious effects on the quality of coverage and the quality of debate. And we need some kind of a publicly oriented and sufficiently arm's length from government body to be in there with an orientation that keeps the public interest a little bit more firmly in mind. Let's put it that way. And I think other countries have realized this and maintain the idea of a well-funded public broadcaster in a way that, especially under the Conservatives, but I have to tell you, the first major cut to CBC was in the 1990s, and $400 million from the Liberals. They had their reasons, the economic issues, and they had to make choices, they will say, but nonetheless, that's where it started. And I just think we need to come up with a new compact that understands what is needed by way of funding and then commits to long-term stable funding, and doesn't have CBC and the people who are the creative power behind it constantly looking over their shoulder or leaving because they think that it's much better to take a job somewhere else because they'll never know whether or not they have a career there.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Craig. And I just want to quickly share, the word Canada comes from the name, a native name, Canada, which means village. And it's up to all of us Canadians to support each other, to reach out, to begin the conversation as we began today with Craig, and hopefully many other people in the future. It's time for all of us Canadians to be proud as our national anthem goes, true north, dong, and free. The only way we're going to remain free is that if each of us people start looking at it as we the people and start standing up for our nation. Start believing in the red and white and the maple leaf. That is our nation, our birthright. And the people that come here, that want to immigrate here, it is your birthright too. Thank you very much for your time there, Craig.
Thank you, Rich.